The events of January 15th, 1947 mark one of the oldest cold cases in Los Angeles. This crime has proven notoriously difficult to solve for the police and amateur sleuths. Betty Berzinger was out on a walk with her daughter through the Leimert Park neighborhood when something strange caught her eye. Initially, Betty believed she was looking at a mannequin due to the way that it was posed on the ground. However, this belief could not have been further from the grisly truth. Upon closer inspection, Berzinger realised that what she had thought was a mannequin was actually the naked body of a young woman that had been severed at the waist and drained of blood. The victim's intestines had been removed and placed underneath her bottom. There were missing pieces of flesh from her thighs and breasts, and her stomach contents contained feces, which led to some to believe that she had been forced to eat them before she was killed. The most chilling mutilation on the body, though, seemed to be slices on each side of a young woman's mouth to her ears, creating what is referred to as a Glasgow smile. The body has been washed clean, and detectives surmise that this must have meant the woman was killed elsewhere and later methodically placed in Leimert Park, where Betty later found the horrifying scene. An autopsy by the Los Angeles County coroner described the body as having light blue eyes, decaying teeth, and brown hair. The description that the coroner gave of the body's injuries were as follows. There were ligature marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck with superficial tissue loss on her right breast. The coroner also noted that there were several superficial lacerations on the right forearm, left upper arm, and lower left side of the chest. The body was thought to be around 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed approximately 115 pounds. The body map shown here shows a very rough idea of the markings noted by the coroner. Trying to identify the body was no easy task, and the LAPD were not able to identify the body alone, so they called in the FBI for support. After running the victim's fingerprints through the database, 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was identified. Her fingerprints had turned up due to the fact that she had applied for a job as a commissary clerk for the U.S. Army camp cook in California back in 1943. Her fingerprints triggered a second time for an arrest that had been made by the Santa Barbara PD for drinking underage just a few months before she had applied for the position of commissary clerk. Short's mother had no idea about her daughter's murder. The way that she'd found out was absolutely disgusting. A Los Angeles Examiner had reporters contact her mother, convincing her that Elizabeth had won a beauty competition, and pushed for as many details as they could regarding Short's life before revealing the horrific truth that her daughter had been murdered, dismembered, and further mutilated. As the media were learning more about Short's history, they began to brand her as a sexual deviant. Some falsely rumoured that the young lady was a prostitute. A police report had stated, quote, the victim knew at least 50 men at the time of her death, and at least 25 men had been seen with her in the 60 days leading up to her death. She was known to be a teaser of men. The media dubbed Short as the Black Dahlia, the name we know her today. This is reportedly due to a reported preference of wearing sheer black clothing. Short had moved to Hollywood just 6 months before her death and had worked as a waitress while hoping to make it big as an actress. It is unknown whether Short had any acting jobs prior to her demise. Her death seems to have been the thing to catapult her into fame. Despite the huge fame of the case, the LAPD were having a lot of trouble with finding out who was responsible for the heinous crime. But around a week after the body was found, the Los Angeles Examiner received a call that could have contained some clues. On January 21st, the Examiner received a call from someone claiming to be responsible for the murder, saying he would send Short's belongings in the mail to prove his claim. True to word, the examiner received a package several days later which contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, some business cards belonging to her, and an address book with the name Mark Hanson on the cover. It must be noted that there were some pages torn out from the address book. This leads some to theorise that Short had met with her murderer and had written their details down in her address book shortly before her demise. These items had been wiped down with gasoline, leaving the items with no fingerprints that could be used to identify the perpetrator. There was a partial fingerprint on the envelope, but this was unable to be analysed as it had been damaged at some point. 5 days later, another handwritten note arrived that read, quote, "Here it is, turning in, Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia, Avenger." The police waited at the time and place, but of course, the author of the letters never decided to show their face. The alleged killer then sent a note mocking police after the no-show. The letter was made up of letters that had been cut and stuck from magazines and read, quote, "Changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." Again, everything sent by the alleged killer had been wiped down with gasoline, and investigators were not able to find any fingerprints on the letters. This includes the note that had just been sent. At one point, more than 750 investigators were working on the case, with more than 150 potential suspects and 60 confessions throughout the initial investigation. None of these confessions were considered legitimate, however they were considered to be people wanting to garner fame and notoriety for such a grisly killing. In the decades since, there have been over 500 confessions, none of which has led to any charges being brought for the murder of a young woman. So who was responsible for the murder of the Black Dahlia? There are hundreds of suspects over the course of the investigation, from the men of listed in Short's address book and medical school graduates. The men listed in Short's address book all stated that they'd only briefly encountered Elizabeth, and had only gone for a meal with her or seen a movie with her before things between them had actually escalated any further. So who could have been responsible for the murder? Let's talk about the main suspects that I could find information about. Suspect 1 is Robert Manley. Manley was a salesman and a former army musician. He had been seeing Short for around a month before she was murdered. Their relationship started when Manley noticed Short alone at a bus stop and asked if she had needed a ride. Initially, Short would not speak to him, but eventually she did get into his car. For the next month, when Manley was in the area, he and Elizabeth would go on dates. When the accommodation that Short was staying at had fallen through, and Short needed a place to stay, Manley claimed Short had called him and asked for him to pick her up. Manley said that the pair had stayed in a hotel in the Pacific Beach strictly as friends. Afterwards, Manley had driven them both to Los Angeles. It was there that Short was taken to Biltmore Hotel on January 9th, leaving her there. As far as anyone is aware, this is the last place that Short was seen alive. This was 6 days before her body was found. When questioned by police, Manley professed his innocence and willingly took 2 polygraph tests, which he passed. Years later, doctors administered sodium pentothal, considered to be a truth serum, and questioned Manley again. Again, it seemed that he was telling the truth, and he was in fact innocent. Manley died from a fall in his apartment in California on January 9th, 1986, 39 years to the day since he last saw Elizabeth Short at the Biltmore Hotel. Suspect 2 is Mark Hanson. As mentioned before, a notebook in Elizabeth's possession, bearing the embossed initials MH, had reached the examiner as an attempt to prove the killer was in fact the person writing to the newspaper. This notebook belonged to Hanson, but he had not used it, and instead Short had ended up using it as her own. At some point, Elizabeth had quit her job waitressing and had moved in with Hanson, but this did not last long. In total, she spent roughly 2 weeks in October and just over a week in November of 1946. It should be noted that during the time that Short lived with Hanson, she was not the only female occupant. Hanson had a bit of a reputation for being a ladies' man, and would only hire young and beautiful women to dance as showgirls. Elizabeth left Hanson's residence permanently in mid-November 1946, following an argument with another one of the girls living with Hanson at the time. Short made contact with Hanson from San Diego on January 8th, which makes him one of the final people known to have spoken to her. DA files imply Hanson had at some point tried to seduce Short, but had been turned down. Hanson had no criminal record and no known history of violent acts. Suspect 3 is Dr. George Hodel. This is one of the more popular suspects associated with the Black Dahlia murder. Many people who have worked on the case over the decades claim that they interacted with him at some point during the investigation. George Hodel was a wealthy doctor in Los Angeles. He was described as being a well-connected, dashing, and having a high IQ. While not being a surgeon himself, George had studied to become a surgeon at medical school, breezing through these classes. It leads some to think George is a more probable suspect because of his knowledge of the anatomy of a human body. With this anatomical knowledge, it would not be outside of the realm of possibility for George to be able to make the precision cuts necessary to sever Short's body. After Hodel's death, his son, Steve Hodel, found several photos which he claimed had looked strikingly similar to Short. There has been no concrete confirmation or denials that these photos are in fact of Elizabeth Short that I could find. This led Steve to begin an investigation into his own father as a potential suspect into the Black Dahlia murder. Steve theorized that his father and Elizabeth had a relationship and that they had been caught together at a hotel in the Los Angeles area. In addition to believing that his father was responsible for Short's death, Steve also believes that his father George could be responsible for the death of Jean French, who was found February 10th, 1947. French was found on Grand View Boulevard, nude and badly beaten, with a message written in lipstick seeming to say BD, which is believed to have stood for Black Dahlia, perhaps as a message to taunt police and show that the perpetrator of the crime was still at large. Historian John Lewis argues that the scrawling actually read PD instead, standing for Police Department. A handwritten note sent to the LA Examiner following the murder were deemed to have the same handwriting as Dr. Hodel by a forensic expert that had been hired by Steve Hodel. Some may speculate that because this expert was hired by Hodel, that there is a potential conflict of interest. Dr. Hodel had £50 sacks of concrete sent to his home for alleged remodelling on January 9th, 1947, the last day that Elizabeth Short had been seen alive. Hodel's son claimed that similar sacks were found near the crime scene and that the police had theorised that these sacks had been used to transport Short's body from the car to the spot in which she had been found. George drove a 1936 Packard, which closely matched the descriptions of a black car that had been seen near the area where Short was found. Steve's research reported that the nature of the way that Short was found also seemed to match the work of surrealist artist and close friend of Hodel, Man Ray. It is speculated by Steve that his father may have wanted to impress Man Ray and showcase his own sick and twisted, quote, art. Tamar Hodel, George's daughter, would recall a time of her father hosting parties at their home, with guests ranging from Man Ray to Hollywood celebrities. Tamar claims that when she was a child, she had posed for indecent photos for Man Ray, and after she ran from home in 1949, she reported her father to the police for trying to teach her about oral sexual acts when she was 11, that he had offered his 14-year-old daughter to guest at his party and had himself had incestuous sex with his daughter. At 15, Tamar gave birth to a daughter named Fauna Hodel, who Tamar had alleged her own dad was the baby's biological father. George was later acquitted of the charges of incest after family members had testified that Tamar was lying, although this could be down to the fact that George was bringing home the main source of income for the family. Hodel's Hollywood residence was electronically bugged some time after the murder by a task force between February and March 1950, where the tapes recorded him as saying, quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe. I did kill my secretary." Did Hodel murder his secretary because she knew too much? Suspiciously, his secretary's death was ruled a suicide by overdose. However, Hodel was investigated as a suspect in a death. After moving to the Philippines, a woman was found in Manila in an eerily similar set of circumstances as the Black Dahlia. She was found in an empty lot, dissected. Supposedly at the time, Hodel lived only a half-mile away from the scene at the time of the murder. The case remains open to this day. Unfortunately, the case may never be definitively solved. Former head of the Violent Crimes Division for the FBI, John Douglas, believes that so much information could be ascertained from the murderer's interactions and time he spent with the body that the crime would be very solvable today. Thank you for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. Keep an eye on my channel shorts section and my TikTok. I'll be posting teasers to upcoming videos. And obviously take care everyone.